Hello and welcome to Awful Commentary's analysis of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. My name is Dominic Archer, and in episode 1, we will be looking at the movie that started it all. Now, if you're not familiar with how it is that the MCU came to be, then please check out episode 0 for a quick history of Marvel Comics. As a quick disclaimer, instead of recounting the entire story of the different movies that we talk about, I'll be working on the assumption that you as the listener have both seen and remember the films that we are discussing. If there are elements of which you are unsure, I would recommend watching it again before continuing so that, we don't fall out unnecessarily. And if you're into your Marvel movies, then, one has to be expected to stay after the credits, so hang around. You've been warned. Now, cast your mind back to 2008. The Beijing Olympics had delighted all and announced China's power on the world stage. A young, hotshot senator from Illinois named Barack Obama was promising hope to a generation that had matured in the shadow of the Twin Towers. Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight had showed cinema-goers something comic readers had known for years, that the superhero could do what your movie does and more, by bagging 8 Oscar nominations and 2 wins. And then there was a little independent film directed by Elf's Jon Favreau, starring a washed-up lead actor that lost most of his credibility to drug scandals in the 90s, playing a character test groups thought was a robot. It took only half the money of Batman, and yet started something that would change Hollywood itself. Robert Downey Jr. plays Tony Stark, a billionaire arms dealer whose vast wealth is only exceeded by his intelligence. And perhaps his vices. Stark's public persona as the heir to his father's legacy has him building, quote, a bigger stick than the other guy, or forging increasingly dangerous and intelligent weapons for the United States military, while going 12 for 12 with the previous year's Maxim girls, thanks to the Christmas cover featuring twins. But to those who know him best, such as his assistant Pepper Potts, played by Gwyneth Paltrow, and his best friend James Rhodey Rhodes, Terrence Howard, Tony's potential for good is near limitless, if only he could find one thing: purpose. Oh, and then he gets kidnapped by Middle Eastern terrorists. Before going any further, it's worth acknowledging how ridiculous the success of Iron Man actually is. By all usual standards of Hollywood norms, it should fall flat on its face long before the cameras start rolling. Here we have a director whose previous movie, Zathura, was a Jumanji sequel that lost money. We have a leading man who in the Halle Berry film Gothica had 40% of his salary held back as insurance against his addictive behaviour. And all of this is funded independently by a comic book publisher that is on the verge of bankruptcy yet again. As I mentioned in the previous episode, Marvel had gambled the movie rights of its remaining B-list properties on a $500 million loan from financier Merrill Lynch to kickstart their own film franchise. But when the rights for Iron Man defaulted from New Line Studios, the bank forbade Marvel from using its acquired funds to make a movie of him, as the character wasn't part of their original deal. But deciding their new project should begin with a character not yet seen before on screen, Marvel gambled yet again by entirely self-financing. Now, there are benefits and negatives to Marvel's plan here. In the plus column, there's no previous incarnation of the character to besmirch his cinematic debut. There's no Adam West Iron Man that colours audience expectations, although that would have been pretty great. It also acts as a clean start, allowing Marvel to build from the ground up and set the creative tone for future movies. Had this been tacked on to Fox's ongoing X-Men franchise, for example, it's beholden to the movies that came before it. In this case, however, Marvel was able to start fresh, while anticipating its future creative direction. On the downside, well, nobody bloody knew who Iron Man was. Marvel's Joe Quesada explained their research showed, quote, awareness issues with the character, especially among kids, and that kids, quote, had no interest in him because they thought he was a robot, end quote. Now, when kids lost interest in robots, I am not sure, but Marvel looked to animator and future Deadpool director Tim Miller to create short Iron Man advertorials, featuring Tony Stark to prove there was a man inside the armour, as well as Spider-Man and the Hulk, to demonstrate that Iron Man's sweet suits made him equal and perhaps superior to Marvel's recognisable brand names. I remember watching these when they came out, and thinking how cool they were. They're full of Easter eggs and great comic book action, and check them out, they're on YouTube. Within the comic book community that was well aware of Iron Man, I think it's fair to say that he had the opposite problem. Speaking from personal opinion, I've never forgiven that dog Tony Stark for betraying Captain America during the Civil War. Cap's assassination is on his hands. Stark is scum. He is scum. I'm sorry, now I got a little bit... But there was an obvious push here to make the founding Avenger a more prominent figure in the Marvel Universe, including making him the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. When the movie came out, it was clear that Marvel's fears were unfounded and that their hard work had paid off. Reviewer Roger Ebert, who confessed to thinking the film featured a robot, said, "At the end of the day, it's Robert Downey Jr. who powers the liftoff, separating this from most other superhero movies. You hire an actor for his strengths, and Downey would not be strong as a one-dimensional mighty man. He's strong because he's smart, quick, and funny, and because we sense his public persona masks deep, private wounds." By building on that, Favreau found his movie, and it's a good one. Ebert's review, as with almost every other that I've read, is quick to point out that while the film's special effects are great, while the Iron Man suit itself is gorgeously modelled and designed, the film is successful because of its leading man. Marvel Studios executive Kevin Feige told The Hollywood Reporter in September 2006 that Robert Downey Jr. had been cast for the part after the actor worked out and had grown the goatee to convince the filmmakers that he was right for the part. Favreau also backed the casting by comparing it to the role of Captain Jack Sparrow, saying, quote, "There was certainly a degree of apprehension when I expressed that he is who I wanted to cast. My biggest sell was who was really interested in watching a movie based on the Disneyland ride. Pirates of the Caribbean didn't seem like an obvious piece of source material, but once you cast Johnny Depp in it, all of a sudden it elevated the enthusiasm level of everyone who heard about it. When we cast Robert, I felt this tremendous weight lifted off of me because half of my job was already done." There's no doubt that 10 years on, Robert Downey Jr. has become the face of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and really of the superhero genre itself. The only person who is able to even remotely compare being Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, but where Wolverine is a hard-drinking, harder-punching bastard from Canada, Hugh Jackman's public persona is one of a lovable family man with fantastic pipes and eyes. God, just eyes to die for. Jackman and Logan could not be more different, which goes to show the level of performance that he has to bring to the role. For Downey Jr., however, he is Tony Stark, with Favreau explaining that it was the actor's past that made him such perfect casting. It's easy to create a handsome, charming, lovable asshole when your actor is all of those things. Tobey Maguire is fine casting for Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, but Maguire isn't struggling to contain charisma in the same way that Downey Jr. is. During a superhero science panel at the 2018 South by Southwest Film Festival, Joe Robert Cole, a writer of Black Panther, suggested that the characteristics of Tony Stark might not work with the audiences today, saying, "Think about where we are now with this very vapid, unintelligent president, and our world is crackling on the edges because of that. Think back to Tony Stark, him being douchey and being okay. If that character Stark was created in a movie today, I wonder if the response would be like, oh, it's cool that he's douchey and disrespectful to women, that's fine. I think we're at a different place. I think we're at a better place." There is a lot of truth in what Cole is saying here. 10 years on, the politics of Iron Man are no longer as relevant as they were during the Iraq and Afghan wars. In regards to Stark's treatment of other people, it's worth recognizing that we are watching a character undergo the hero's journey. Stark is disrespectful and frankly borderline abusive to every character in the film as a way of masking his grief, isolation, and regret. This doesn't make him a good person, but it does make him human, and therefore engaging. This can be seen at the very start of the movie, before the film's inciting incident sparks the common conflict, where the wittiest of his lines revolve around his blasé attitude to war crimes, such as when a soldier throws up a peace sign and he says, "Yeah, peace, I love peace, I'd be out of a job with peace." Or during the beautifully scripted Da Vinci of our time / Merchant of Death conversation. It's an imperfect world, but it's the only one we've got. I guarantee you, the day weapons are no longer needed to keep the peace, I'll start making bricks and beams for baby hospitals. Part of Stark's character development is stepping away from the self-indulgent lifestyle that puts money and women ahead of civilian lives. A change that could be seen as more relevant now than it was 10 years ago. And realizing that the people he is most indebted to are the ones closest to him all along. While it may be unintentional, this part of Stark's character reflects America's reliance on destructive power rather than efficiency. One of the major problems that America had fighting the war on terror is that it's not a conventional war in which you claim territory. Instead, enemies can appear on your street corners or on public transportation while your tanks are 5,000 miles away securing oil fields. In his 2002 State of the Union address, then President George W. Bush said, "These enemies view the entire world as a battlefield, and we must pursue them wherever they are. As long as training camps operate, as long as nations harbor terrorists, freedom is at risk, and America and our allies must not and will not allow it. Our military has put terror training camps in Afghanistan out of business, yet camps still exist in at least a dozen countries. A terrorist underworld, including groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Jaish-e-Mohammed, operate in remote jungles and deserts and hide in the center of large cities." End quote. The conventional high-tech weapons that Stark has developed would be essentially useless against these groups, and are shown to be ineffective against fictional terror group the Ten Rings, precisely because finding the enemy is unconventional. But this doesn't stop Stark Industries from profiteering from the conflict, and it certainly doesn't prevent Tony's mentor and business partner Obadiah Stane from selling armaments to terrorists under the table. Even with all the superheroics removed, Iron Man deserves recognition alongside Andrew Nichols' Lord of War for critiquing post-9/11 foreign policy and how the practices of Western arm manufacturers can impact destabilized nations. Multiple references are made to the might of American imperialism by highlighting the Stark family's history with weapons of mass destruction. It's mentioned as a point of pride that Tony's father, Howard Stark, worked on the Manhattan Project, which led to the creation of nuclear weapons, and that their fortune is built upon the back of that reputation. Harry S. Truman, the president who ordered the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is quoted as saying, "The atom bomb was no great decision. It was merely another powerful weapon in the arsenal of righteousness." And it's with this same attitude that Tony Stark approaches his use of his WMD, the Jericho missile, as seen at the beginning of the film. The missile takes its name from the Book of Jericho, Volume 6, passages 1 to 26, where the Israelites were said to have surrounded the walls of the Canaanite city Jericho and brought them down with nothing but the divine blow of their horns. Weapons in the arsenal of righteousness indeed. Jericho is clearly positioned as the nuclear weapon for the 21st century, with Stark explaining that it incorporates his new repulsor technology, the very mechanism that will allow Iron Man to fly later in the movie. Tony announces that Jericho is part of the new Stark Industries Freedom line, once again referencing post-9/11 ideas of Americanism, and infamously says, "They say the best weapon is one you never have to fire. I respectfully disagree. I prefer the weapon you only need to fire once. That's how Dad did it, that's how America does it, and it's worked out pretty well so far. Find an excuse to let one of these off the chain, and I personally guarantee you the bad guys won't even want to come out of their caves." Later in the movie, Jeff Bridges' villain Obadiah Stane says that in trying to protect people, Tony has given the world its best weapon yet, in reference to the Iron Man armor. And where the Iron Man armor stands differently from the rest of Stark's inventions is the symbolism that it provides. The suit works both as an effective nuclear deterrent, but also as a guardian figure who provides a certain hope, as seen by the fight in Golmira, the hometown of the man who saved Tony's life. In this scene, he protects civilians and then destroys the terrorist group's power base. The Iron Man suit provides hope to those who desperately need it, while regular Stark weapons exist only to create fear, as demonstrated with the film's opening irony of Tony being struck by a shell with his own name on it. One comment I thought was particularly interesting came from the article Iron Man 1 Terrorist Zero by Sonny Bunch, which asserted that the politics you take away from the film are the ones that you came in with. Bunch explains, if you go into Iron Man seeking right-wing imagery, you'll find it. Tony Stark is a patriot, pro-military, and likes unilateral intervention. If you go into Iron Man looking for left-wing imagery, you'll find that too. The true villain here is Stain, representing an out-of-control military-industrial complex. For libertarians, there is a clear message of personal responsibility in Tony Stark's redemption. When the news shows Golmira ravaged by terrorism, the reporter describes it as a modern-day heart of darkness and explains that with little political will to act, the refugees are all but helpless. The very systems created to defend these people have left them to die, and only by Stark acting outside of government will they be saved, a theme expanded on in Iron Man 2. With that being said, if Tony Stark can be taken as a stand-in for how corporate interests have commercialized and profited from the suffering of America's military interference in Middle Eastern politics, then Iron Man makes it clear that his actions were mistaken and are the cause of much more harm than good. Despite appearances, the terrorist group named the 10 Rings are not the true villain of this movie. They are merely pawns in the wider chess game of American military might. Their cause isn't depicted as evil, although their methods are shown to involve kidnapping and executions. But it's clear that none of this would be possible without the aid of American backers who are looking to profit from the slaughter. The group themselves greet Iron Man by saying, "Welcome, Tony Stark, the most famous mass murderer in the history of America." The 10 Rings are said to be made up of an international cadre of soldiers speaking Arabic, Dari, English, Farsi, Hungarian, Mongolian, Pashto, Russian, and Urdu. Although they reside in Afghanistan and are obviously inspired by American perceptions of groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, they are not Islamic-based, as one might expect subsequently to 9/11 and the war in Iraq. Instead, they seem to be built from members of low socio-economic status, as shown by a news reporter's mention that men of destroyed settlements are often forced into the militia. This puts the 10 Rings in direct contrast to the movie's protagonist and Obadiah Stane, its villain. Neither man takes the time to analyse why people of such wide cultural backgrounds might unify under the banner of the 10 Rings. Neither try to use their billions of dollars to prevent it. Instead, they build giant robot suits and punch each other around Los Angeles. And of course, this is a superhero movie, and a similar argument can be made for Bruce Wayne as Batman. But what makes Iron Man different is that he never has any qualms about using lethal force. Where Batman's understanding of criminal motives prevents him from murder, Iron Man never seems to hesitate. This is interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, because we never have any inclination that Stark has killed before, at least not directly. Stark's character development revolves around acknowledging his guilt and his complicity in death, as seen in the press conference scene after his return, where he announces, "I saw young Americans killed by the very weapons I created to defend them and protect them. And I saw I had become part of a system that was comfortable with zero accountability." And yet this only seems to extend to Americans and to civilians. Despite his own invulnerability once in the Iron Man armor, he's never shown to display reluctance or remorse when fighting soldiers that he knows have been press-ganged into this militia. While the film is quick to highlight who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, Tony Stark's willingness to take life should kind of be a cause for concern, especially when he's positioned as a hero. This concept is part of what would be touched upon in Iron Man 2 and Captain America Civil War, but always in a negative light. The heroes know what they're doing. Deal with it. With that said, incredibly, Favreau managed to make an inherently political critique of America that everyone can get behind. Well, I mean, everyone who isn't illegally selling weapons in Afghanistan. And in that vein, it's frankly tragic that I have not spent more time talking about Jeff Bridges in this movie. Obadiah Stane is no one's favourite Marvel villain, and that is almost a crime. Yes, on the one hand, he does start the trend of bad guys who are simply a mirror reflection of their heroes. Red Skull, Abomination, Justin Hammer, Whiplash, Killmonger. There's a lot of them, but Jeff Bridges is almost flawless in his performance. Robert Downey Jr. said that it was important to him that Tony Stark remains recognisably the same person while walking the path to heroism, saying, quote, "What was really important to me was to not have him change so much that he's unrecognisable. When someone used to be a schmuck and they're not anymore, hopefully they still have a sense of humour." End quote. And as true as that is for Stark, it is just as true for his nemesis. Stane does not just become villainous, he is still recognisably the same character throughout, but there comes a point in which his priorities change, and when that happens, everything steps up a notch. Writers for the film said there were multiple scenes of Bridges that didn't make it into the final cut due to time constraints, but that of all the possible edits, this was the best because Bridges shines so brightly when he is on screen that he doesn't even need to hog the limelight. You feel his warmth and paternal affection for Tony at the beginning, and you feel his anger and frustration as the world he has built starts to crumble down. While for Pepper and Rhodey, Tony's misbehaviours have been a constant thorn in their side, for Stane they have been his company's lifeblood. As long as Tony stays in his garage, designing things that blow up and doesn't ask too many questions, well, everything functions perfectly. But as soon as Tony starts to think more than he's supposed to, problems emerge. I wanted to find some Obadiah Stane quotes to include that give you a feeling of the character's motivations or of his political stance or what the character represents in this film. And there are some fantastic lines, such as where Stane refers to Stark Industries as ironmongers. He creates his supervillain identity and gives an authentic insight as to how he views his purpose in life. But honestly, I became too distracted by Bridges' performance. There's a moment towards the end of the film where Stane is revealed as the villain and is rushing to create the Ironmonger armour, to forge these Iron Warriors before he's caught. He berates one of his chief engineers who claims that the technology to develop the suit, to develop the arc reactor necessary to power the suit, just doesn't exist yet, and Bridges bellows,
"Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave with a box of scraps!"
Now, I don't know if we were able to insert the actual audio for this into the podcast or if it runs the risk of some kind of copyright infringement. If you're listening to my voice, I'm sorry that I can't do justice to what is truly amazing about that line. It's the first time we've seen an intellectually intimidating character switch to physical intimidation. When Stane confronts the 10 rings, he does so with a paralysis tool. He does not engage them in a fight, he stuns them and then calmly explains his motivations. But with the engineer, as his frustration begins to grow, Bridges leans into the scientist's face, and you can almost feel the pee running down that guy's leg at the sheer intensity of Bridges' deliverance. In this one moment, we acknowledge Stane as a physical threat to Tony, setting up the final conflict. I do feel that it's a shame that the character is killed at the end of the film, especially given how good Bridges is. It's a shame that he's not able to play a similar role to Tom Hiddleston as Loki, as a recurring antagonist. And as for the recurring characters that we have come to know and love, this is where we get our first introduction to Gwyneth Paltrow's Pepper Potts, Tony Stark's assistant and love interest without whom he wouldn't last a week. There are multiple points in this movie where it showcases the value and strength of Pepper Potts, ranging from her intellectual understanding of the arts to her being of invaluable assistance to S.H.I.E.L.D., an intelligence agency that without her kind of appears to lack intelligence. The only times where Pepper seems out of her depth are during these brief moments of romance that grow between herself and Tony, and when it comes to this strange new world of superheroics, including sticking her hand into his chest and detonating the arc reactor at the movie's climax. There is also the matter of who is actually heroic in this movie. Obviously, the title and the spotlight go to Tony Stark, but even the comic books are prefixed with the word invincible. He is the invincible Iron Man. And if you're invincible, then there's no bravery in your actions because there is no fear. Once he's escaped from captivity at the beginning of the movie, Tony never really finds himself in a situation where he expresses genuine fear, mostly because he's surrounded by a robotic exoskeleton with the military capability of a small nation. But for Potts, engaging with the exploits of Iron Man puts her in constant danger. It is Pepper who first braves the wrath of the Ironmonger, and she does so without any of the technological advantages of Stark. It's Pepper Potts who outwits the villain and uncovers their villainous schemes. And ultimately, it's Pepper who defeats Stain after Iron Man has been ripped apart. She may not be kicking ass in the same vein as Scarlett Johansson's Black Widow or Zoe Salander's Gamora, but Paltrow keeps up with Downey Jr. at every turn in a way that lends legitimacy and authenticity to their relationship. And it is the little interactions and character moments that ground an otherwise ridiculous movie in reality. When Tony and Happy Hogan, who's Stark's driver played by Favreau, when they interact, you get a real sense of their relationship. In the brief moments where Paltrow shares a scene with another supporting cast member, be it Bridges or Terrence Howard as Rhodey, their conversations feel genuine to a point where we feel they're desperate. What is he going to do this time? These are the only people that Tony interacts with on a day-to-day basis, and this kind of leaves them trapped in his orbit. I've deliberately left Terrence Howard for last because he's a point of controversy. Howard's role in the film as Colonel James Rhodes, the future hero war machine, is to play the straight man to Downey Jr.'s comedy. Rhodes is both Stark's liaison to the military and also his best friend, who is constantly struggling to deal with the wake of Tony's antics. Howard does a good job of conveying a man caught in a hurricane. It doesn't matter how disciplined or how strong you are. When you're faced with the force of nature, you can only resist it or surrender to it. And here we are shown a character who, despite every attempt at resistance, is inevitably washed downstream. This is kind of best displayed during the flight to Afghanistan, where business talk is interrupted with alcohol and pole dancing, and all Rhodes can do is lecture about the merits of his military uniform. He tells Stark, "You are more than what you are." And ultimately, he's right. If Pepper is Tony's heart, then Rhodey is his head. And this dichotomy plays beautifully given the actors' on-screen chemistry. And with this chemistry, people were pretty surprised to hear of Howard's departure from the franchise after Iron Man 1, being replaced by Crash co-star Don Cheadle. Accounts on the split differ, with Howard blaming Downey Jr.'s greed, saying they came to me with the second and said, "Look, we'll pay you 1/8 of what we contractually had for you because we think the second one will be successful with or without you. And I called my friend that I helped get the first job, and he didn't call me back for 3 months." Obviously, the friend in question there is Downey Jr., perhaps having embraced the lovable asshole mantra a little too much. And while there are rumours of Howard being difficult to work with on set, the Tony Stark amounts of money Downey received for future movies, combined with Marvel's reputation when dealing with actors, and see Edward Norton, make it more plausible that the MCU is built on the back of shredded contracts. If the last few years of failed attempts have proven anything, it's that a franchise is only as strong as its foundations, and thank God for Iron Man. Favreau creates a deliberately realistic tone from which Asgards and super soldiers can plausibly develop, while Downey Jr. sets the standard for what will be expected of superheroes going forward. Marvel took an incredible gamble on a property nobody wanted, with an actor nobody wanted, and has reaped the rewards ever since. But that doesn't mean that it was plain sailing for Stark and friends. In fact, the next movie in the MCU was a pseudo-sequel reboot, that saw its lead actor clash with the studio and distributor over creative direction before vowing never to play the character again. In the next episode, we'll be examining 2008's The Incredible Hulk. So, did you stick around? I hope so, because I have one more thing to say. At the time of recording is May 2018, just after the release of Infinity War. The MCU has given us some amazing moments, but I don't know that there are any that can top what I'm going to discuss now. The Battle of New York at the end of the first Avengers is incredible, sure. And the entire first half of Guardians of the Galaxy is pure gold. Hell, the boat assault on the Lemurian Star at the beginning of Captain America Winter Soldier basically redefined that character. But for pure, giddy, squealing in the cinema, nothing can top the post-credit scene of Iron Man. Tony Stark comes home to find his personal AI Jarvis, who I'm sorry that I've otherwise had to avoid due to time constraints. That he's been corrupted, and there's a figure waiting for him in the darkness. Someone who clearly has technology that rivals his own, someone of secrecy and power who has no fear of the invincible Iron Man. Nick Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D., steps forward, sending every comic book fan into fits. And it's easy to forget now that we've seen Iron Man reflect repulsor blast off Captain America's shield into alien armies, that a time existed when this was either on a page or pure imagination. But when Samuel L. Jackson tells Tony Stark, "I'm here to talk to you about the Avengers Initiative," I think many of us figuratively died. The genius of putting this tease after the credits rather than in the movie is that there's no excess weight or unnecessary plot holding the film back, and that it also acts as a de facto reward for those willing to wait. It also creates instant anticipation for the movies that are to come. And if you are like me 10 years on, then you know it has been a privilege to watch that potential unfold before us.